I would give him really low marks on his economic performance.
Okay, we'd like to welcome your questions now. And again, if you'd wait for Amon to come around with a microphone, that would be great.
You just mentioned tax policy. As things currently stand, a whole slew of taxes are set to be raised in 2013 and beyond. What might that do to economic growth, all else equal?
I think there are two things to focus on. One is the impacts of the policies themselves when they roll off and revert to earlier levels. And the other is the uncertainty that it creates in the decision making for both individuals and for businesses as they think out to try to figure out what's coming down the road. So I think that the uncertainty effects may actually be as important as the ultimate consequences of the policies. I'm a believer, although I will confess that the actual empirical evidence that supports this, I think, is a little bit divided. That higher marginal rates do have important distortionary effects, so that returning to higher rates would lead to less economic activity. What we do know with some confidence is that when you raise rates, especially at the higher ends of the income distribution, you see taxable income shrink. People find ways, whether it's in the old days you would have taken perks in the form of a chauffeur-driven limousine or other sorts of things that were sort of non-taxable benefits, as opposed to taking cash compensation. And in the days since tax rates fell first to 28% in 1986 and then to somewhat higher rates, I think there's been more flowing through of income that people are willing to take the income and report it and pay taxes on it. So one thing that would happen if we go to the higher rates is we would see some reduction in the amount of taxable income reported. But I think the other thing which really is a major concern right now is just that when people don't know what the longer term policy is going to be, whether the R&D credit's going to be there, whether they're going to have high rates or low rates, whether capital gains rates are going to be high or low, it does really throw a wrench into any kind of long-term planning.
So I think really the only good economic policy that Bush did was his two tax cuts, most especially the 2003 tax cut, which was basically designed by Glenn Hubbard, I believe. And the reason I thought that was very positive is because it really was aimed at reducing marginal tax rates, most especially on dividends, which are a tax on savings, which is not a particularly good part of a wise tax system. And I also thought it made sense to move away from high taxation on estates, which I think is a form of savings that you don't want to have a high tax rate on. So of course, given that I think that was the only real economic contribution from the two Bush terms, I would be very much opposed to eliminating those tax reforms. Now, I'm not saying that higher tax revenues would not be part of a broad reform and a broad policy aimed at getting our fiscal state in good order. I think it's right that the government is going to end up raising more revenue as a share of GDP, along with cutting back on certain expenditure programs. But the way you want to raise more revenue is not just to eliminate the 2003 in particular tax cuts and go back to the higher marginal rates on certain types of income that were in place before that. You want to think about an overall system of tax reform, which is likely to mean lower marginal tax rates and broadening of the base. So it certainly would be a big mistake for Republicans to go along with not extending the Bush tax cuts that were put in 2001 and 2003.
Question over here.
I'm curious about that last statement, because when I look at the first couple of charts, and I follow the baseline projection in terms of the resulting reduction in deficits and the big change in the percent of the deficits related to GDP, those look like very positive developments, which ought to have secondary benefits as well in terms of beginning to get the cost of borrowing under control as well over the long term. So since I'm not getting it, can you expand a little bit on why that baseline projection, which assumes that those things do expire, wouldn't have these very positive benefits?
First off, those are not my charts. I did have a handout because I noticed Jim had a handout, so I figured I had to have a handout, but I wasn't planning to refer to it. I do agree that you want to have reduced fiscal deficits, and I think the important question is how do you go about doing that? So as I said, I thought you want more on the revenue side, you want cuts on the expenditure side. I think you want a package of those two things. But I think you want a coherent program that's aimed at promoting economic growth while you're doing that. And I think we can do much better in terms of getting more tax revenue as a share of GDP than just eliminating the tax cuts that were in the Bush 2001 and 2003. So I already mentioned the value-added tax, which is a much more efficient system of taxation. I don't think any economist really would disagree with that. There's some disagreement about the nature of the income.
Type of tax, even if it's efficient.
I was going to say it may or may not be regressive depending on how you have it designed. It's not inevitable that a consumption tax is a regressive tax. But certain kinds of value-added taxes that, for example, cover everything at a common rate, which is the most efficient, is also going to be a flat rate tax rather than a progressive tax. So that's one reason people object to it. The other reason, which I mentioned before, is that people think it's a money machine, that this gives tremendous revenue to the government, which is then going to grow larger. So Larry Summers has some famous quote about when is it that you're going to have a value-added tax in the U.S.? So it's when Republicans realize that it's regressive and when Democrats realize that it's a money machine. That's when you're actually going to get it occurring. Something like that was from Larry Summers.
So let me just say, one further thing on that. The conventional wisdom in tax reform politicking is that it's much easier to reform your tax system when you have a surplus. That if you'd been in, remember, 11 years ago in 2001, we were having a serious discussion about what the federal government was going to do when it ran out of debt, because it had purchased back all of the federal debt through the surpluses that we were going to continue to run. And the discussion was whether it would be appropriate for the federal government to take ownership stakes in private companies as an investment vehicle at that point with its continuing surpluses. Now we've gotten to the ownership stakes just by a different route than we were expecting. But it's usually thought that when you have extra revenue available so that you can compensate people who are going to lose preferred tax breaks, that it's easier to broaden the base and move toward a more efficient tax code. I think that we're actually about to test a sort of flip side of that, which is when it's pretty clear that you're going to raise more revenue going forward, right? You then don't want to have a tax code which has a lot of inefficiency in it because it's going to create a bigger burden, a bigger drag on your economy. So what I hope we will see in early 2013 is a serious discussion, around the lines of some of what Robert has said on what is the nature of the tax system that we would like to run with going forward. And do we want to preserve the full set of deductions that currently cost us a lot of revenue? Are we prepared to eliminate some of those deductions, broaden the base of the tax on the income tax, possibly complement it with a value-added tax or something else? Right? When you take these pieces in isolation, a value-added tax may look like it's relatively regressive, but remember, no one's proposing scrapping everything and going to just a value-added tax. As long as you have an individual income tax in place, you can still get some progressivity out of that, and in many ways undo what happens with your value-added tax if you're concerned about that. So the real thing I think is to take a step back and say, rather than, it is clearly the path of least resistance for those who want to raise revenue is just going to be to say, let the 01 and 03 acts expire and look at all the revenue we will collect. But the more systematic way to tackle this problem is to say, let's look at the structure of the tax code. It's been 25 years since 25 years since we did anything serious on tax reform. A lot of weeds have grown up since the 2006 Act, and this is now the moment to revisit that and then see if we can come out with a more efficient structure. And then using that more efficient structure, if we have to raise more revenue, the burdens won't be as great.
The other thing is this also has to be part of the discussion with the expenditure side, and particularly with entitlement reform. And I think it's very natural to think about entitlement reform along with tax reform as sort of a common package of ideas.
So we have time for one more question.
I think the gentleman right over here, his hand raised.
Could you use the mic? Oh, well, sorry.
You touched on Europe earlier. At the end of the day, does Greece matter?
The same son who had the economics gene was a class assist at one stage, so I think I'd have to say the answer was, of course, Greece matters. But economically, Economically, the impact of Greece flows through the way its securities are embedded in the European financial system at this point, and the collateral damage that might flow to some of the European banks if Greece were to go into default. Greece by itself is not large enough to cause a lot of damage to the global economy. It's the ripple effects and the dominoes that could fall in response to a Greek situation that are more of a concern. And the thing which is hardest and which macroeconomists and financial economists struggle with a lot is figuring out how expectations would adjust in the event that something dramatic happened in Greece. So if you go through a default environment in Greece, does that then lead you to think that Italy and Portugal and Spain are basically in line for something similar? So you have to decide what the market participants would think in the event that Greece goes through various kinds of sort of play out scenarios. And I think that's where some of the global importance comes from.
Yeah, I mean, the major Euro members decided some time ago that they couldn't let Greece basically go bankrupt, default on its debts in an explicit manner. And a lot of that was concerned about the fallout for European banks, particularly in France and Germany. But I think that was a mistaken calculation. I think it would have been much better 2 years ago to let Greece go bankrupt and do whatever you had to essentially kick them out of the Eurozone. I think that would have made it stronger for the countries that were next down the road, Italy and Spain being particularly important in that context. So I think it was the wrong calculation. We actually discussed this at a New York Federal Reserve Bank advisory meeting a couple years ago. And of course, I'm used to taking crazy positions like, you should make Greece go bankrupt and kick them out of the euro. But everybody at that meeting 2 years ago agreed with that sentiment, which I thought was quite shocking. The other thing was that explicitly there seemed to be no way literally to kick them out involuntarily from the euro. But we agreed at the time that everybody else could leave. And that would, that would have the same impact.
So we're going to wrap up now, and we have a few other little business items to take care of. Kat.
Good. Well, that was fascinating. I think we've all learned a great deal here tonight, and so thank you very, very much.